The prosecution in the Sean Diddy Combs federal sex trafficking and conspiracy trial has rested its case after more than a month of hearing testimony from more than 30 witnesses. Both the prosecution and defence rest, which could bring the trial closer to an earlier than expected conclusion. Kenya Davis is a partner at Boyes Schiller Flexner and former Assistant U.S. Attorney and co-chair of the DC Human Trafficking Task Force. She's not involved with the Sean Diddy case directly, but joins us now to give her perspectives as a third-party source. Kenya, you've been following this case closely. What have been some of the key moments in the trial so far?
I think thank you for having me this morning. I think the key moments have been, of course, the direct testimony from the victims in the case. They provide us a window into not only the acts that were happening at the time, but also their perception of them and the level of coercive control that they felt under during the course of the acts. And so that provides us the perspective that we need to be able to evaluate the behavior that we've seen testified about by, I think we are at about 34 witnesses for the prosecution in this case.
Well, the defence didn't call any witnesses and only took around 20 minutes to sum up their case. Is that unusual?
It's not actually. I've been asked that a lot. In our country, the defense has no obligation to put on a defense at all. The defendant does not. He does not have an obligation to testify. And it really is the prosecution. And I used to carry this weight, which is it is the prosecution's job to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. There have been some effective cross-examinations, but I do still feel that the evidence is overwhelming in favor of the prosecution.
Well, just the fact that Shawn Combs chose not to testify, do you think that'll help or hurt his case?
It's only the defense attorney's perspective on his client's ability to do well in front of a jury, and also his calculus about how well the case has come in for him. He's the only one really in the position to make that call. And I've seen it both ways. I have cross-examined defendants, and in those cases where I was cross-examining defendants, it did not go well for them, mostly because you can't really navigate around all of the evidence that the prosecution has been able to put forth in its case. A federal prosecution is very serious in our country.
What are the jurors specifically being asked to consider when it comes to delivering a decision on this case? How challenging will it be for them to arrive at a verdict?
Well, jurors in this case have had the benefit of an expert witness. And I can't stress enough how important that is in a human trafficking case. I've tried both sex cases and labor trafficking cases. And when you have adult victims in particular, it's easier for a jury to understand when the victims are children. But when you have adult victims in particular, it's important that the jury is educated about what human trafficking is and how the elements come together. So for an adult who's been charged with sex trafficking, there have to be three areas present here: force, fraud, or coercion. And so we've all seen the force, right? We've all seen the video of Cassie being assaulted, but it takes a little bit more than that, because that as an isolated incident doesn't get us to human trafficking. However, there's commercial sex. We know that there was sex in exchange for money or some good. That's an element that they have to find. And the prosecution is going to have a chart that basically lays all of this out for them very clearly. But they're looking at force. They're looking at the fact that it was commercial sex. They are looking at here the fraud of her being promised things about her career, about how her career would advance, the things that she was sort of offered as an initial part of being brought into these unusual sexual circumstances. And then the last piece, which I think is the most important in this case, and what I've seen in all of the cases that I've tried, is what I call a web of coercive control, a web of coercion that involves not only the main defendant, but also all of the people around who sort of co-sign on what's happening to this victim. They see her assaulted. They don't do anything. They understand all of the elements that are happening, and they sort of all agree with it to the point where she doesn't necessarily feel like she can reach outside of that web and get the kind of help that she needs. Here in particular, there's one point in the trial in particular that I think says a lot to the jury about that coercive control. The fact that the hotel assault happens just before she's doing a movie premiere, which is one of the highest points in her career, says a lot about the amount of control that he wanted to continue to have over her. Her showing up, being concerned about a black eye, being concerned about the bruises that she was needing to hide. That's going to really land with the jury, I think, very strongly to show the level of control he wanted to continue to have over her. And for those who have who often will argue, well, this is just two consenting adults, they have a tumultuous relationship. I will note, with my background in doing domestic violence cases as well, I also ask juries to look at the fact that he doesn't have any injuries. He doesn't have a black eye to worry about. So that tells you what the dynamics of power were in this relationship and how it wasn't just a normal people argue, people disagree in a relationship. This is a power dynamic that is very prevalent in trafficking situations.
What do you think then is the likelihood of a hung jury, and what would happen if that were the case?
Well, that is a possibility in our system. Here, for a criminal prosecution, you have to have a unanimous verdict. Just one of those jurors being convinced that the government has not met its burden is enough to hang that jury. And then the prosecution has to decide whether or not they will go forward with retrying that case, because double jeopardy does not attach at that point. The prosecution could decide to retry that case and see where it goes then.
And would Shawn Combs be looking at spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted on all counts, or could he possibly be pardoned by President Donald Trump if that were to happen, and on what basis?
Well, when it comes to the sentencing, it's important to note that the jury only makes a decision as to culpability. The jury does not make the decision about sentencing. That is a decision that is made by the federal judge that is hearing the case. He will look at the judge will look at the sentencing guidelines that we have, look at the charges that the jury finds him guilty of or not guilty of, and decide in that range where Mr. Combs would fall. I'll also note that this jurisdiction that he's in, the Southern District of New York, is not known to give life sentences. So I think that is highly unlikely. But again, that is a determination that the judge has to make. And as to pardons, that is something that, that is a black box that none of us sort of are privy to in terms of how those decisions are made by the president.
Of course. How soon might we know the outcome of this trial? You've said that the prosecution have a very strong case. Do you think Shawn Combs is more likely to be convicted rather than acquitted?
My view of it is that this is not an easy case, but I do think that they have presented quite a number of points where the jury could hang its hat on the idea that this young lady and the other Jane Doe were victims of sexual trafficking by Mr. Combs and his enterprise. Because remember, we're not just talking about him, we're talking about all of the pieces around him. But as to when that jury will come back with a verdict, that is, that's a mystery that all of us trial lawyers try to solve as we sit around at the courthouse often waiting for on bated breath for that jury to give us a verdict. But, I think the lawyering here has been excellent on both sides. I think that, the work that's been done has been extensive in terms of the grand jury investigation that was done before this case was put before the jury. There are always pieces of evidence that we will never see as the public because the judge would have determined that those pieces were not relevant or would have been highly prejudicial. So there is a trial sort of back behind the trial that happens. And unless you're in that box sitting there as one of those jurors, you really do not have an idea as to how they're going to decide.
Well, we will find out sooner, hopefully, rather than later. Kenya Davis, thank you so much for your analysis. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.